Hey everybody, this is Meyer, and in this video what I'm going to do is talk about the difference between audio and MIDI, in particular the difference between audio and MIDI in Studio One. And the reason I want to talk about this right now is I find this is one of those things that really confuses a lot of new producers. So understanding the difference between audio and MIDI tracks and how they're presented within Studio One, I guess will really help you in becoming a better producer and becoming a more seasoned producer. So let's start by talking about what audio tracks look like in Studio One, and then we'll move on to MIDI and how at the end, they both end up becoming audio when they reach the mixer stage. So we're presented here with the basic project with an audio track, which contains audio information, and a MIDI track or an instrument track, which holds note information. And at the end of the day, all MIDI is really note information. It's information about what notes are played, when the note should start, and when the note should end. So it has nothing to do with the actual sounds that are used. And we'll talk about this more later, but when a lot of people think of MIDI, they think of the old computerized sounds that don't sound very good. It's actually not what MIDI is at all. It's just a protocol for computers to understand what notes are. So when people are talking about, oh, send me the MIDI for this, they're just talking about sending the notes. It's like a digital score for your computer to understand. So within Studio One, you have these things called clips, and they can either be an audio clip, which is contained within an audio track, or a MIDI clip or a note clip, which is contained within a MIDI or an instrument track, which are the same thing. The MIDI and instrument track are the same thing. So let's first look at what an audio clip looks like. So if I double click on this DS_BAS140_A, what I'll be presented with is this edit tab here. And notice how that the selected track is the lighter one. So if I click on this edit tab or I double click on this red one, I'll be presented with the audio editor, which allows me to make cuts to the audio and do things like reversing it, time stretching it, adjusting the volume. And what's going on in this audio file is it's mirroring the pressure changes or the voltage changes that will then be applied to your speaker. Now this audio file is being described within your computer, so it's not actually containing voltage changes. But as the playhead or this little white line moves from left to right, it'll encounter this audio file, and as it does so, that audio information or those voltage changes that are virtually stored in your computer are being sent out the mixer and then out of your speakers. And that's what you hear as an audio file. So of course, when the selected track is an audio track, the edit tab displays audio editing functions. And these include destructive editing functions, which are things that will actually affect the original audio file itself. So sometimes certain editing features like reversing or changing volume will actually edit the audio file that's stored on your disk, or if you recorded something within the Studio One, it'll actually edit that audio file, or non-destructive editing, which would be muting parts of the audio, but it's always reversible. You can always undo it or kind of revert back to the original way the audio file is. So some people prefer to work destructively and others non-destructively. I tend to work more non-destructively because when I'm producing, I tend to be non-committal. I don't like really committing to having to make any changes and not being able to go back to the way it was, but certain features are more one way or the other. On the other hand, if we are selecting a MIDI track, notice how the selected track now is this lighter color track. Our edit page looks a lot different. So the edit page in general is going to allow you more complicated editing for clips. And of course, once again, what's presented there is going to depend on whether or not you're viewing an audio clip or a MIDI clip. So in this case, we're actually presented with what's called a piano roll because this MIDI information is stored as note information. And then the way we like to represent it within a Digital Audio Workstation, as we talked about last week, is within this piano roll, which shows as a function of time what notes are being played. It's kind of like a music box. So in this case, these notes are what's called MIDI information. And there's a couple things that are available for you there to look at when it comes to MIDI information. First is, of course, the notes and the rhythms, which are actually the notes on the keyboard being played. But if you notice below, there's also velocity, which is how hard each note is being played. And notice how not all of these notes are being played at the same velocity. Some are being played with a lower velocity than others, which can be a very large value. So that's also MIDI information, is note velocity, and then other sort of control changes that we'll talk about later on in the course. But the thing to keep in mind here about audio versus MIDI is with an audio track, you don't really have control over what notes are being played. Yeah, you can go in there and individually pitch certain sections of the audio up and down, but if you're dealing with something polyphonic, which means multiple notes being played at the same time, it can be very difficult to extract and change any of those individual notes because it's all encoded within the audio file. Whereas with MIDI, if you have a chord that's being played, it's just as easy as selecting one of those notes and dragging it up or down. And the other benefit to working with MIDI is you can always change the sound that's playing these notes. So since all MIDI is note data, we can always change that instrument from a synthesizer to being played by a sampler that may be sounding like a violin. We can always change what instruments are playing those notes, whereas with an audio file, it's pretty much impossible to do that without applying all sorts of effects and things like that. So, and generally most electronic producers tend to prefer to work with MIDI. But of course, if you're working with a band or somebody who's an experienced instrumentalist, they're generally going to record what they're doing to audio, which is then of course going to be played back in your digital audio workstation. So it depends if you're more of a producer in the sense that you're actually working with the MIDI itself, or you're kind of doing more mixing where you're working with audio files. And then of course you have people like hip hop producers who kind of do a little bit of both. They a lot of times will sample some old record or something like that, and that's bringing in the audio, and then they'll sequence drums on top of it, which is usually stored in MIDI information. The other thing to keep in mind with MIDI information is how it's actually being played within the computer. So of course with the audio file, as the playhead moves across the audio file, it's very obvious that those changes, those up and downs in the audio file are being translated into the forward and backward motion of your speakers. But with MIDI clips, it can be a little bit more obscure as to what's going on when you're playing a MIDI file. So what's going on with your MIDI file is as the playhead collides with these notes, it gets a note on command for each time it collides with the beginning of a note, and when the note ends or when it reaches the end of the note, it sends a note off command. These note on and off commands, along with information like the pitch and the velocity and things like that, are actually sent to the individual instrument that's responding to MIDI. So in this case, it's Presence, which is an instrument contained within Studio One that is responding to these MIDI changes or these notes, and then of course translating that into sound. But the nice thing about MIDI is, once again, you're flexible. You can change that instrument, and another instrument may respond differently to the different pitches or the different notes. But in the grand scheme of things, you're kind of having this overall baseline way of describing to your instrument what you're asking it to do. And that's why all the different synthesizers and different keyboards out there are able to respond to the same type of note data. You don't have to encode that note data any differently for it to talk to, say, something like an Access Virus versus any of the other VSTs contained within your digital audio workstation. They pretty much all respond to MIDI. Now, whether they respond to things like Aftertouch, MPE, that may depend on the individual instrument itself, but pretty much all of them are going to respond to note on and off, velocity, things like that. So of course, within Studio One, we have our MIDI tracks or instrument tracks, and that data is contained within the piano roll, which has what we call MIDI notes there within Studio One. And I guarantee if you look at any other digital audio workstation, be it Ableton Live, Logic Pro, FL Studio, the way they represent MIDI and the way they represent things with the piano roll is going to be really consistent across the board. Because at the end of the day, all of their idea of instrument tracks or instrument channels or whatever they're called within these digital audio workstations are fundamentally working with MIDI, whereas their version of audio tracks or an audio editor are working exactly with these audio files, which are usually .wav or WAV file or .mp3. Most of the time people use WAV files because it's lossless compression. We'll talk more about that later on in the course. But for now, just kind of understand that this language of talking about audio versus MIDI tracks is really important, and it's pretty ubiquitous across all the different digital audio workstations. Thanks for watching. Go ahead and check out that Discord, and we'll be talking about more tips and tricks. If you have any questions, feel free to leave a comment. I know this can be pretty confusing, and if you already know about all this stuff, good for you. See you in the next video.